Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting young man to introduce you to tonight. His name is Wyatt Sharpe. He's a 13-year-old journalist, and he's the host of the Wyatt Sharpe Show. He's had an incredible list of guests on his podcast. He's interviewed Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Finland's former Prime Minister, and many, many more. He's had some articles written about him in the Toronto Star and in something called loonypolitics.ca and much, much more. Wyatt Sharpe, how are you, buddy?
Good. How are you, Brian? Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me. So you're in a hotel somewhere?
Yeah, I am. Sorry about any of the background noise, but yeah, no, I am in Ottawa right now, actually, in the nation's capital.
How come you're in Ottawa, in the nation's capital, in a hotel?
Well, I have a few interviews planned for my show, and I have a couple of other stuff that I'm doing with other journalists, one journalist from Global News and one journalist from CTV News. So lots of fun stuff.
Who are you interviewing this week?
Well, this coming week, I have lots of interviews specifically in Ottawa. I'll be speaking to Tim Powers about the Conservative leadership race from Summa Strategies. And then, later on this week, lots of exciting interviews on kind of, you could say, the news of the week, or of some of the relevant news stories that will be quite relevant probably coming up. Obviously, we have the German Chancellor coming to Canada this week, so that'll be a very big story that probably will not just be big in Canada, but also in many other countries around the world as well.
How does a 13-year-old get involved in journalism and hosting his own podcast?
I think it's kind of just like something that, obviously you might not see many other young people, take up journalism, or specifically in my case, I cover politics the most. So you might not see people or young people specifically take up things like journalism very often. I think encouraging young people to do it is really important. I know for myself, getting started is really, there's not like one specific like detail that I can point to as to how I actually got started in it. I think it was kind of just realizing that being able to tell people stories, being able to speak to people that seem quite relevant on the current issues of the day is probably, as I always say, the most rewarding thing about being involved in journalism, whether you're a young person or just a regular adult, you could say, doing journalism as well. But one thing I found through my time in journalism is people don't necessarily treat me of my age. I often get that question, like, do people treat you as if you're 13? Oftentimes, no. I mean, there is still some hesitancy, you could maybe say, from certain elected officials to do interviews just because, perhaps they don't know who I am before, and then they might not be expecting necessarily, you could say, tougher questions. So, no, I definitely think that getting started in journalism at a young age is a great way to pursue it eventually later on down the road as a career path, which is what I'm hopefully hoping for.
What do your friends at school think about your journalism and podcasts?
Yeah, that's another question I get frequently. It's like for me, it's no different than, say, them being interested in hockey or in other sports or baseball or whatever the case may be, which, I mean, I am as well to a certain extent, but obviously politics I am way more heavily involved in than, say, sports. I don't know too much about sports, and so, I mean, I think everyone just has their different things that you could say they're passionate about, and in my case it's journalism and politics, and in their case you could say it is sports, etc. But no, they like it. We've watched some of my interviews collectively together as a class, as almost like as lessons, you could say, to try and learn more about the election, whether it was during the provincial election or the federal election. So no, again, it really has been super great. And just like, again, despite them maybe my friends not knowing too much about kind of the political journalism lens of things, they still, again, very, very supportive of everything, as are all my teachers, educators, and just people in, my everyday life.
Do you think it's mostly young people or older people, adults, that listen to your podcasts?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's, I don't necessarily, like, when looking and preparing an interview, it's not necessarily in my mind, okay, who's going to be the number one target audience of this. Obviously, there's some interviews that I do for my program where more older people or adults will be watching the specific interview. There's some interviews that perhaps I do that young people might take more of an interest in. So like preparing individual interviews, yes, obviously there's going to be in some cases a certain demographic of people who maybe are impacted by it more and therefore may watch it more heavily than other demographics. But I still think again, when I'm preparing an interview, it's not necessarily specifically aimed or drived at towards one age demographic. It's kind of, again, everyone I hope takes value you could say, from the interviews that I do and from my program.
Who is the most interesting person you've interviewed?
I think there's kind of multiple answers you could give to that question. I mean, I think Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was really an interesting person to speak to. He's the leader of our country. He has the most impact on the way that Canadians go about kind of living their everyday lives, in the sense of he's the one that has the most, you could say, legislative power to like introduce laws, et cetera, in Canada. So, I mean, talking to him was just very interesting in the sense of, being able to say that I got a chance to interview our prime minister. But I also think that, Finland's former prime minister, as you mentioned there in the introduction, was also really cool to speak to because it was during the global conflict in Ukraine. It was right around the time that Finland was kind of debating whether or not they should join the NATO alliance. So I think everyone is interesting in their own regards, in the sense of they're all able to speak on different issues. And again, Finland's former prime minister, as I mentioned, is a great example of that, being able to interview him during the global conflict in Ukraine, which, how close Finland's proximity is to Russia and to Ukraine. That's interesting in and on its own, let alone the fact that Finland was trying to join NATO at the time. So, I mean, a conversation with Finland's former prime minister, again, in an instance like that is, how you might consider that interesting. And then again, I've done many other interviews too with people that are just relevant to the news cycle, and that some interviews, what I found, Brian, is that they might not be like a very well-known name, but the topic is so well-known that people almost don't necessarily care the person's title. They just want to hear more about the topic from whoever it is, which is something that I also found very interesting. Like one of my top viewed interviews is not someone that you might know super duper well unless you are heavily involved in politics or journalism. But again, it really is just different people take an interest in it, depending on how much it impacts them, is kind of the main way that I would look at it.
If people want to check you out, how do they do that?
Yeah, so I have my YouTube show, the Wyatt Sharpe Show. I'm on Twitter as well. As are basically all journalists at Wyatt Sharpe 8. And then obviously Instagram as well. But YouTube is where I post all my interviews, and probably the thing that people would take the most value from getting to actually watch the interviews that I do and that I conduct. Well,
check out the Wyatt Sharpe Show on YouTube. We're going to take a break for 2 minutes for some messages and get back with Wyatt in just a few seconds. I'm going to ask him a little bit more about some of the policies and the issues that he thinks are preeminent in Canada today. Stay with us, everybody. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with Wyatt Sharpe. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. One of the most interesting 13-year-olds I've ever met is Wyatt Sharpe. He's a 13-year-old journalist, and he is the host of the Wyatt Sharpe Show, podcasts and videocasts on YouTube. He's interviewed Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Finland's former Prime Minister, and many, many more. Wyatt, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much, Brian.
So tell me about some of the shows that you have done, because they're just fascinating. Some of the people that you've been able to interview. Like, it's really quite impressive.
Yeah, no, it's been definitely very interesting. And obviously there's kind of the biggest names out of the people that I've interviewed, like Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and, Finland's former Prime Minister, as you said. But there's also many people that I've interviewed that perhaps people might not know as well. But again, as I said before, the issue is very important to people. Examples of that would be, say, panels that I do on certain topics. I did a panel the other day on how various conservative strategists believe that Pierre Poilievre is the front runner in the conservative leadership race, but he does lack ideas and policies. That was like kind of the main topic that was brought up in that panel discussion. I interviewed all of our federal party leaders as well, which was definitely an interesting conversation. Ontario's party leaders, I've interviewed all of them, including Premier Doug Ford, which was actually really interesting because it was right at the height of the COVID pandemic. It was in, I believe, February of 2021. And yeah, no, he had a lot of insight. It was just the same day that the AstraZeneca vaccine was approved rather. So he had lots of insight on that as to, how Ontario was going to get its certain share of the AstraZeneca vaccine. I've spoken to federal cabinet ministers. Again, other panel discussions. I was at Queen's Park just the other day for a conversation, the throne speech and the reintroduced budget. So lots of interesting stuff, definitely.
So you introduced 2 days ago someone on long-term care. Tell me about what you think the issue is on long-term care in Ontario today.
Yeah, so on long-term care, I interviewed Dr. Vivian Stampatopoulos, who's a really well-known long-term care advocate and researcher in the province of Ontario. And it was just after the announcement by Health Minister Sylvia Jones and Long-Term Care Minister Paul Calandra, I believe one of the first, if not the first, announcement by the Health Minister since being appointed as Health Minister back in June. And so the long-term care advocate and researcher that I spoke with, again, Dr. Vivian Stampatopoulos, spoke about the announcement. She was not happy with certain parts of it. She spoke a little bit about the human right to consent and how she wasn't happy with some of the certain changes that were made in the as it relates to the announcement that was made. So long-term care is definitely an issue that was, during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people who have, a family member or relative in long-term care, they obviously have grown to be, in some cases, frustrated with the Ford government. Not in all cases, but in some cases, frustrated with the Ford government. And so, long-term care is an issue that is definitely, again, very important to the lives of people, again, specifically for those that have family members or relatives in long-term care right now, but also to people who might be looking in the future and saying, well, I have a family member eventually who might have to go to long-term care and I don't want to have to send them there because of the conditions in long-term care. So, again, there's lots of kind of stakeholders involved in the issue of long-term care. And it really is just, I guess, finding a balance of how to deal with the issue, a very important issue in this case.
So I think as the baby boom ages, we're going to have an unbelievable amount of people that are going to be in need of care. And I just don't think there's any way that institutionally we can house them all in long-term care facilities. So I'm convinced that the solution is home care. And the Ford government has recently announced, extra funding for home care. What do you think the solution is for your generation that's going to have to be funding all of those services that are spent on my generation?
Look, like I said, I think there's obviously a very robust conversation to be had on how long-term care and how a lot of people who say have to stay in a hospital because they can't get into long-term care. And that's something that Dr. Vivian Stampatopoulos, who I spoke with on this issue, was very she talked about it a lot actually in that interview. I think in terms of my generation, I think that it'll be a conversation to have, and I think people should be having that conversation. How it should be dealt with. Obviously, some people are calling on the government to provide more funding. Some people say that funding won't address the issue. There's many different perspectives on it, as is there all issues in politics. So I think, again, it's just kind of moving forward, seeing how perhaps if this announcement made by the Ford government makes any difference. Just the other day they announced 60, I believe it was 6,000 additional healthcare workers and 2,500 new beds across the province of Ontario. Does that announcement make a positive difference? There was some concern as it relates to that announcement that, okay, but what are you going to do to ensure that those nurses that you're hiring don't end up in the same situation as the ones who are already leaving? But if the announcement that is made is a positive announcement and it does move forward in a positive way, and they can, convince these nurses to stay and they can actually free up those 2,500 new beds, then I think there will be a conversation to be had about how important funding towards long-term care and towards healthcare like that actually is. And I think it'll be an interesting conversation to have moving forward.
Tell me about your interview with Dr. Christopher Labos about monkeypox. What a fascinating topic that really is something that we're not all aware of, but it's becoming front page news. Tell me about monkeypox.
Like you said, it's not really something that too many people are aware of. I think a lot of people have probably heard about it in the news. They're not really too sure about what the actual what monkeypox actually is. But I mean, I think it's just, he spoke a lot about the concern. He mentioned how you don't have to be as concerned with it in the sense of COVID you can get from, say, going to the grocery store and just coming in close proximity to someone who's already tested positive. This one, it has to be a little bit more in depth. He mentioned skin to skin contact, etc. So it has to be a lot different than, say, a virus like COVID, as an example. He said there's not too much worry for certain people and for a lot of people, but just moving forward, just, be careful as you would, and just try your best to avoid it.
You interviewed several people on the upcoming Tory leadership campaign. Tell me about that interview and what you thought about that.
Yeah, that's the one I was referring to earlier about how it was many Tory strategists and how they, did believe that Pierre Poilievre is going to be the front runner in the Conservative leadership campaign, but how he doesn't have a lot of ideas and how he doesn't have a lot of policy. And that interview actually got a lot of feedback from certain members of Parliament, some specifically who were unhappy with the interview. But I mean,
they were unhappy with the interview. Why were they unhappy with the interview?
Well, they were unhappy with some of the guests that I had on and some of their takes on Pierre Poilievre and how, as I said, some of the panelists, the majority of panelists on this show believe that Pierre Poilievre lacked policy and lacked certain ideas. So some members of Parliament who had endorsed Pierre Poilievre in the Conservative leadership campaign were unhappy with that specifically.
So you just didn't, they're saying that you didn't have a balanced number of people on the show?
No, they were unhappy with, they didn't say anything about like the actual people who I interviewed. They just weren't unhappy with some of the takes that fake news, I believe is what one of them had said. But again, they're going to have their opinions, specifically the ones that have endorsed Pierre Poilievre, and they're free to have those opinions. And obviously moving forward in the Conservative leadership race, some people like Pierre Poilievre, who seems to be the favorite within the Conservative Party, having the most caucus endorsements. So yeah, again, I mean, just they weren't unhappy with me or my show. As a matter of fact, I've actually interviewed that member of Parliament before that commented that. They were just unhappy, I think, specifically with the takes of some of the people that I had on.
That's not your problem. That's the problem of those people. So tell me about Jean Charest, because you actually interviewed him too.
Yeah, I have had him twice on my program in the midst of the Conservative leadership race. He is obviously, what we spoke a lot about in that interview is some of the accusations from the Poilievre campaign that, he seems to be more of a liberal and that he should not lead the Conservative Party specifically before that. His response to it was kind of interesting in the sense of he basically said, well, my message to Mr. Poilievre is, what about all of the people who voted Liberal in the past or who have considered voting Liberal in the past? Does that mean that they're no longer welcome in the Conservative Party of Canada? I mean, he did reject as well the fundamental, premise that Mr. Poilievre is calling him a Liberal. He said he led a coalition of Federalists, as people have probably heard Mr. Charest and his campaign team say before. He led a coalition of Federalists in Quebec during the 1995 referendum to basically prevent Quebec from leaving the rest of Canada. So that's his argument. He said he led, again, the coalition of Federalists because Quebec did not have a Conservative Party. So it was kind of a mixture of the two of them.
Have you interviewed Pierre Poilievre?
No, I got a promise from his campaign team at the beginning of the campaign. I think it was in February or March, saying, yeah, absolutely. We'll absolutely have Pierre on your show, and they have not followed through with it, and we're running out of time. So, but yeah, so hopefully soon. But again, we're running out of time. So
if you were voting in that leadership campaign, who would you vote for?
Well, I think as a journalist, it's kind of important to remain unbiased and not partisan. But obviously, Conservative members have their preference, and they have the person who will advance, who they believe will advance the party forward. Some people believe that's Pierre Poilievre. Others believe it's Jean Charest. And then one of the other interesting things, too, is some of the other candidates running in this race. Obviously, Leslyn Lewis running against someone who performed better than expected in the 2020 race.
I lost you.
Who was kicked out of the Progressive Conservative Party's caucus. So, I mean, that'll be interesting. And then obviously Scott Aitchison, who's running as well.
In the last federal campaign, you actually interviewed every single one of the leadership candidates, the different leaders of all the different parties. Tell me, that must have been a fascinating experience for you to actually compare Aaron O'Toole, Justin Trudeau, Annamie Paul, Jagmeet Singh, etc.
Yeah, no, again, it was really great. I mean, it was during the majority of them were during the election campaign, Justin Trudeau, Aaron O'Toole. They were obviously the two main party leaders in the campaign, the two people that probably had the biggest chance at getting elected as Canada's next prime minister. So obviously the two people that Canadians probably want to hear from the most in an election campaign. And then Annamie Paul has an interesting story. I actually interviewed her just before the election was called in August. And it was right around the time when kind of the Green Party turmoil was ongoing. So it was an interesting conversation in the sense of, well, how is she going to unite the Green Party of Canada in the midst of this, conflict within her own party? And Jagmeet Singh, I mean, regardless of whether or not you actually like him as a federal party leader, he is still someone who you can say fights for what he believes in very strongly, and is very passionate about what he believes in. Something that I think from even people across the aisle would be willing to at least come to terms with and agree with me on that, in that sense that, he fights for what he believes in and is very, very effective at fighting for what he believes in. And he has a lot of personality in that sense.
So I was just wondering, as I was looking at your shows, that Justin Trudeau gave you twice as much time as Aaron O'Toole, and Jagmeet Singh was 3 times as much time. Is that indicative of anything? Was it a more interesting conversation with one versus the other, or were they just more forthcoming to you, or like, why the difference in times?
Well, with the Prime Minister, we didn't necessarily intend to go that long. It was just, we had only had, I think, 10 minutes booked, maybe even less than that, but his answers were so in-depth and so insightful that it kind of went beyond that. And I mean, for Aaron O'Toole, the reason his was so short, to be honest, was because it was in person at a campaign event in Whitby, Ontario, and it was so short notice. Like, I didn't even know before I got to the event that I would be doing that interview. I had got to the event, I asked his press secretary and his director of comms if it would be a possibility to do the interview, and they said yes. And then we were working out time, and they said, yeah, okay, we can do it, but he only had 5 minutes. So whereas Justin Trudeau didn't have that much more notice, it was only less than a day. But
and Jagmeet Singh, over 15 minutes, 16 minutes and 31 seconds. How'd that get arranged?
Yeah, well, I've interviewed him twice on my program, and I've talked to him before as well off of my program. And I mean, he's just someone who, as I said, he's very passionate about what he believes in, and he's willing to talk about what he believes in for as long as you want to talk about it. I had asked him at the time, I think my first interview with him was in June of 2021. I'd asked him to do an interview, and his press secretary and people that we were working with to schedule the interview just said, yes, absolutely. He has 15 minutes. And it was actually an MP that I interviewed in the NDP party caucus, Charlie Angus, who had said, well, we need to get Jagmeet Singh on your show. This is kind of just after my show had started. It started in January of 2021. So I think there might have been some internal conversations to try to get him on my show, which again was very interesting. He was one of my first big guests on my show.
Fantastic. Remind us if people want to check out your podcast, your video cast, how do they do that?
Yeah, so it's on YouTube, The Wyatt Sharpe Show, and on Twitter, just search up Wyatt Sharpe 8, and I'll be the first one that pops up.
The Wyatt Sharpe Show. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in 2 minutes, and we're going to ask Wyatt to interview me and see what good questions he asks. Stay with us, everybody. We're going to be back with Wyatt Sharpe in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960, interviewing really quite an interesting young man. Wyatt Sharpe is his name. He's 13 years old. He's a journalist, and he's got his own show on YouTube and posts them on Twitter. And he talks with the leaders of each one of the political parties and lots of interesting people on topics of the day. So we're going to turn the tables here, and we're going to ask Wyatt Sharpe to give us a sense of how he does the interviews and ask him to interview me. So Wyatt Sharpe, over to you, sir.
Sorry, I just had to move spot so it's not as loud. No, definitely. I guess what made you start out in broadcasting and in journalism?
So I've been involved in politics. I probably got involved in politics at a comparable age to you. I was 12 years old, and I ended up going to a leadership convention of the Ontario Liberal Party. My second cousin was running for leader of the Liberal Party, and I caught the bug of politics at a young age, and stayed involved in politics throughout my life. Business was always something that I was better at, and obviously spent more time in business, but always was really interested in current events and what was going on in politics. And a couple of years ago, a local radio station in Mississauga, who has some reasonably right-wing commentators, hosts in the morning time, needed to really balance their programming, and so therefore they reached out to me and asked me if I could do a show that would be, they thought initially progressive, and I would say progressive, but it's probably not as left wing as they think, because I'm most of a centrist. So I actually just this past week, Wyatt, celebrated my 1000th interview on YouTube.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's definitely an accomplishment for sure. Interesting. So you're more progressive than you would be right wing?
Yeah, I'm a centrist. I call myself a fiscal conservative and a social progressive. I think that's frankly where most Canadians are. Right now, I listened to a little bit of your show with the several commentators on the Tory leadership. I've interviewed numerous people involved in the Tory leadership. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I had people from something called Centrised Conservatives on, and if you haven't met them, you should. Where a lot of them are worried that the Conservative Party has gone too far to the right, and with Pierre Poilievre, it may go even farther to the right. And then at the same time, I've interviewed a couple of different liberal, former liberal commentators that are worried that the Liberal Party has gone too far to the left. And so I think there's a gaping hole in the middle of the political spectrum, and that's where I think I am, and I think that's where the vast majority of Canadians are. Socially progressive, but fiscally prudent or conservative.
Cool. Yeah, no, definitely. What about the fact of, I know you ran for the, I believe it was the None of the Above party in the last election campaign. What was that about?
I firmly believe in the tenets of the None of the Above party and direct democracy. Obviously not running for a major party, there was little chance of winning, but I wanted to be able to make my argument. And I think that, frankly, some of the results of that election proved out my beliefs. We had something like, what was a 42% turnout, one of the lowest turnouts, if not the lowest turnout in Canadian history, the lowest turnout in Ontario history. So a lot of the people just didn't care. And then we had a majority government elected with just about 40% of 40%, which is like less than 20%. So we've got this majority government that's elected with less than 20% of the people actually voting for them. And a very strange situation. And I've been a long-term proponent of proportional representation based on popular vote. The Conservative vote ended up being a heck of a lot more efficient than, for example, the Liberal vote or the Green vote, and the NDP vote was a lot more efficient. So that the NDP, with the same percentage votes, got like 4 times as many seats. So in other words, a NDP voter was worth 4.5 to 5 times a Liberal voter. And the Green voter only elected one person, but if you take a look at their percentage, it was effectively equal to 1/16 of the vote of a Conservative. And so if you ever told people that a Conservative voter was 16 times more powerful than a Green voter, and an NDP voter was 5 times more powerful than a Liberal voter, people would really question whether we actually have one person, one vote, which is what our democracy is all about. So I think our first past the post system just doesn't work, and proportional representation is the solution. And that's what I was arguing for more than anything else. I also think that recall is key. And I think that referendum is a potential solution to a lot of our problems. And you think about some of the major issues that we've had in Canada, whether it be the change of our electoral system and or Quebec separation, we've understood that we can't just allow our elected representatives to decide, and we put it to a referendum. So, I think there are other issues that should go to referendum. If you take a look at California, if you take a look at Switzerland, there are jurisdictions in this world that have a lot more votes that go to to the people to actually vote on them. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So the 3 R's of that campaign were about referendum, recall, and proportional representation.
And let me know when you want me to stop. But I guess just what about the none of the above party, in the sense of what are some of its main policy stances and some of the main things that you believed in through running for them?
Well, I think those three, direct democracy that I talked about, recall, proportional representation, and referendum, are the key tenets of the none of the above party. But some of the other policies that I was running on are fiscal sustainability. I think that our debt levels are at all-time highs, and I think it's a real issue. And I think that it's going to lead to a challenge that if we have a recession, governments aren't going to have any fiscal room to do anything. And so we need to have more fiscal sustainability, more fiscal sanity, which is the fiscal conservative in me coming out. And at the same time, I think that some of the things that you've interviewed people about. I think long-term care was the tragedy of the COVID-19 pandemic time period, and what we were doing is warehousing our seniors in institutional care that just wasn't healthy, wasn't appropriate. The HVAC systems were some of the poorest HVAC systems, and as we found out more and more about this airborne disease, is that if you've got a good HVAC system, it's far more difficult to get. And some of our long-term care facilities were just completely inappropriate. Some of our institutions were completely inappropriate. I thought that the way that the government shut down schools, there's a statistic that came out recently that said 50% of 10-year-olds can't read, and they're harmed the rest of their life because they've missed out on 2 years worth of learning, and they've spent way too much time on video like we're doing rather than actually reading. And you got to be able to read if you're going to be able to function in our society. And I think that that's a problem. And I had some teachers over for dinner last night, and they were telling me about these kids that were supposedly on Zooms with their teachers and playing video games at the same time, that it was almost impossible. And one of the gentlemen said, it was like we were forcing our kids to watch the worst TV that you could ever imagine and thinking it was actually going to educate them. So I think we did very poorly by our seniors, and I think we did very poorly by our young people during the pandemic. And I think that that's the fault of government. And I think government has to change and had to change. And I think it's been a travesty. And I think it's going to impact, obviously it impacted seniors' lives. Mortality was outrageously high. And I worry that it's going to impact, maybe not smart guys like you, but there's going to be a lot of young people that have spent 2 years on video or a portion of that time on video rather than actually interacting with people and reading, and they're not going to be as successful in life.
Interesting. No, yeah. I mean, just lastly, then I guess before I have to go, but I mean, what do you think about in terms of, I guess, the education of young people? Just following up with what you just asked, or what you just answered, with the education of young people. I mean, how should the government move forward with ensuring that education is set as a priority for people, and so that way it doesn't end up in the same situation as it has in the past?
So I think that the pandemic has turned into an endemic situation where it's out in the community and there's not much we can do to stop it. I think that we've seen that young people, it's very difficult for them to. They can catch the virus, but they heal very quickly. They get over it very quickly. And so I think that we're in a situation where we should not be closing schools again. And even if we have a surge in the fall, we've learned our lesson that kids in school learning is more important than closing it down and restricting the transmission of the pandemic. That said, clearly the issue is the kids bringing the virus home to grandparents. And so therefore, rather than not having kids go to school, what we got to be able to do is we've got to make sure that people are smart enough to keep the kids, once they've come home, a little bit distant from their grandparents if they live in multi-generational households. I think that we're going to have to do some remedial work, and people are planning on that, and we got to do it. We got to make sure that some of the losses in the last 2 years are made up with some extra efforts, particularly in things that you wouldn't have been able to do as easily on video. And reading is the key. And so we've got to put an intensive effort in that. And then I think the other thing, and it may sound really sort of mundane and stupid, but you probably know that that the average institution, school or long-term care facility in Ontario has 3 atmosphere changes an hour. So the air, because of the HVAC systems, turn over every 20 minutes. It only takes 15 minutes to get the virus. The average airplane, the average hockey rink, has 10 atmosphere changes per hour. 6 minutes it's changed. So it's very difficult to get the virus in a place with really good ventilation. That's why you can't get it outside very easily. So what do we have to do? We have to invest in better ventilation. And whether it's COVID or the next variant, or frankly, just the flu or colds, we got to have better ventilation. And it sounds kind of mundane, but it's an easy and smart solution. Anyway, Wyatt Sharpe, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for your podcast. It's fascinating. Good luck. I look forward to watching some more of your interviews.
Thanks so much, Brian. Really appreciate it.
Well, that's our show tonight with Wyatt Sharpe. Check him out, the Wyatt Sharpe Show on YouTube. We're going to take a break and come back more in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.